Thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. It's such a pleasure to have you in Dubai.
Thank you for having me. It's always really joyous when I get to come to Dubai. I see it as both a vacation, but also this time around it's a bit more professional. But it's so lovely to be here. And one day I think maybe I'll live here. So we'll see.
Amazing. I was following your journey actually in recent months, and it was so interesting to see how quickly it scaled. I would love to ask you how you ask your guests in the beginning, like, what do you think was not necessarily the catalyst for you being where you are now, but what was the pivot point? Because obviously there was a drastic change from where you were to where you are now.
I think there's been a number of like compounding factors in my life that have led me to where I am now. I think if you zoom out over the last like 10 years, it probably started 10 years ago. Obviously making the decision to leave university and start a business was a really defining moment for me. That took many years to become a success. Throughout that time, I started working on building my personal brand as well, in kind of tandem to running my business. And then I think when my business became very big and joined the stock market and was worth hundreds and hundreds of millions, my personal brand was also very big and I was a known person. And then upon leaving my company, I could focus more, maybe a little bit more on the brand side of things. And I had the resources, I had the reputation, and so a lot of doors opened for me. One of them is Dragon's Den. I became a dragon on TV. I had more time to focus on my brand, so I started doing my podcast more seriously and applying the principles I'd learned about how to scale a big platform or an audience from the last 10 years of building a social media company and working on the biggest brands in the world. And it's a culmination of factors and like a compounding. When I look at the compounding returns as it relates to like finance or growing a social media audience, it's pretty much the same. It's super slow then fast. Like it's usually a hockey stick. And but the slow part is as consequential and as important as the fast part. In fact, without the slow part, you don't get the fast part. So I think it sometimes appears that things have changed suddenly, but I think the trajectory of my life has actually been quite predictable.
It's like getting the wheel to turn in the beginning is getting it moving is the hardest part.
Yeah, and then persisting when there's like no return. So persisting when you're shoplifting pizzas to feed yourself and you're getting paid £1,000 in year 3, where like most people would quit because most people don't want to do that. Most people don't want to be disowned by their family. Most people don't want to struggle. They want the safer, the more easy, comfortable, certain route. And so I say this to entrepreneurs because it's important that, you know, say hypothetically I'm worth 100 million now, and I started 10 years ago, I actually made 10 million a year. Like in that first year, although I wasn't able to go to the bank and take it out the ATM, I actually made 10 million that year when I was shoplifting pizzas. And I made 10 million the next year. And I made 10 million because all of those years are stacked on top of each other like a Jenga tower to take you to where you are today. And you can't really skip a step in the staircase. So
I was reading a book recently, really interesting. I'm sure you've read it, called Atomic Habits, where they talk about this idea of like compounding factors or being this 1%, improving 1% day on day, month on month, year on year. And I know you believe in this.
Yeah.
I also think it's really interesting when you talk about your Dragon's Den. I really believe in manifestation. And I think it's really interesting. I wonder whether in the back of your mind, when you saw that when you were younger, whether that was something that subconsciously you were driving towards or bringing towards you. Do you believe that?
So it's interesting. So in fact, I mean, I can really make you believe in it. Because
I believe in it.
I sent a message to my team 3 months before they emailed and said, I want to be a dragon. And then I got an email from the BBC saying, we want to meet, we're from Dragon's Den. Yeah. Even there's other things that like pretty much everything significant that's happened in my life, I've literally got in writing me saying I want to do it. It's within about up to a year of it happening. And Dragon's Den was another example. I sent the screenshot to my team the other day so they could see. I say, and this is the exchange, I've decided I want to do Dragon's Den. I want to be a dragon. And then my manager at the time was kind of a bit skeptical. And my response is, we can do anything we want if we believe we can. And then if you scroll down in the thread 3 months, I dropped the email in from the BBC and they've contacted me saying, we want to meet with you to talk to you about Dragon's Den. The concept of manifestation is interesting and dangerous because there's a culture of believing that you just have to set the sat nav. No, you have to go through the BS. Yeah, exactly. Which is what I always say. You have to I always say to people, if you just set the sat nav in your car in the morning, where will you go? Nowhere.
I agree.
You'll be in your car and eventually you'll die of hunger in your car. If you just drive, where will you go? nowhere, you'll be lost. You have to set the sat nav and then you have to drive. The driving is probably the harder part. We can all sit in our bed and dream big, although a lot of the time we don't actually believe those dreams, but we can all sit around and set sat navs. Driving is the hard part. It's the bit nobody wants to do. So one without the other makes no sense to me. And yes, of course, like I definitely manifested my entire life. I mean, my diary at 18 years old, which I've shared a million times online, shared the picture, it's on my Facebook, everything. I wrote in the front page of my diary, when I was 18, living in the worst part of the town, literally penniless, hadn't paid my rent for 4 months and my rent was only £150. I wrote, by the time I'm 25, a Range Rover Sport will be my first car. I didn't have a driving license at the time. I will have £1 million, I'll have a six-pack and a girlfriend. And by the age of 23, a Range Rover Sport was my first car. I had many millions of pounds. I had a six-pack and a girlfriend. So of course, I wrote that in my diary and then I aimed for it. But then I was willing to drive. Yeah. And I was willing to drive in an obsessive way, which I don't really think many other people are willing to do.
I think it's not just driving, it's driving until you get there, right? Like it's not getting out of the car until you get to where you want to go.
Yeah, and hitting a couple of dead ends along the way, you know, because any hypothesis you have about the route is probably wrong. It's nearly always wrong. Like if you look at all major companies, whether it's Netflix or whatever, their hypothesis about how the pathway to their success is so clearly fundamentally wrong. And so you go, okay, well, how do I be the type of person that is going to set a hypothesis that I know is wrong and still survive and get there? Well, it comes down to like humility, ego, caring more about success than being right. So for me, I mean, started a business, had a hypothesis. Turns out I was wrong, but I was able to change direction and pursue something else in time before we capsized and died. So, and that's really like what a lot of the time when I see entrepreneurs and the businesses they're building, they're too stubborn about their hypothesis. So they'll say, I'm going to start this business, our customers, these people are going to buy from me in this way using this system, maybe a website, maybe they'll come to my shop on the high street and they'll start and they were wrong about something. And they keep trying to force the hypothesis. They keep trying to force product market fit when there isn't a fit. And then they run out of money. And so like the entrepreneurs that I think have the highest potential are those that are humble enough to like look at what the data is telling them and adjust accordingly. And I think I did that maybe by accident.
Two of the podcasts that you did that were for me personally most interesting and which kind of go back to that point. I loved the one about Calm and I loved the one about Gymshark because I think in both of those, one was, you know, in the car, in sense of the Calm app, he had changed exactly what he was trying to build so many times. And it was almost by accident that kind of happened because it was really, you know, in meditating, because the whole situation was quite stressful, that he realized that this was something that people needed. Yeah. And then that went on further to, you know, like the sleep stories and everything. I thought it was really interesting with Gymshark where on a personal level, you know, Ben Francis, founder, looked at himself and said, okay, I am X, Y, Z. I need to change this about myself in order to take the company. So then it's not the pivot point of actually what's going on with the company. It's the pivot point of how you see yourself, how you're delivering what you're doing every day. And I found that super interesting. What I wondered is, do you see particular traits, now you've interviewed so many successful people, do you see particular traits that you think a lot of entrepreneurs have? Because in terms of when I'm watching these, sometimes they always start saying, I didn't have a lot of friends at school. And I feel like there's some kind of like insular, not that they're not social people, but I feel like there's some kind of magic in and around people that are able to be on their own, having this thought process. I don't know if you've picked up on any particular traits of people in general that you've seen.
I think as a very easy to understand thesis, that if someone is to become an anomaly when they're an adult, they probably have an anomalous childhood, like generally. So like Eddie Hearn, you know, the pressure he had from his dad and how that made him feel so insecure is probably the reason he got to where he is. I think it's almost certainly. For me, it was very similar. I think insecurity and ambition look very similar on the surface. So someone that's driven because they're insecure, I've had loads of guests on that, like amazing athletes, for example, and it's so clear that they became obsessed with the gym because it was a place they went where they felt like they had some control in their life or to escape bullies. And so I always think that generally, but it's not always the case. It's not always the case, which is important to say, because there really is no rules like to being successful or being an entrepreneur. And the whole like entrepreneurial industry tries to distill things down to rules to sell you books, courses, and all other forms of BS. But they're really, like, you come to learn that there's like no real rules. There are principles which are more conducive with success. But, you know, I've had guests on that have had pretty perfect upbringings that have gone on to make billion-dollar companies. And then I've had a lot who have had, you know, domestic violence at home, don't know their parents, and, you know, and it's so interesting because when I started the podcast, I thought that's what I was going to uncover, like the secret to being successful. And I've come to learn two things which actually are kind of like a contradiction. The first is that we're all like really fundamentally the same. So if X happens to a human being, you're going to get a variety of different reactions, but they're all going to be pretty extreme. So if you get bullied on the playground at school really, really severely, there will be an adverse, severe reaction. And that can go both ways. You can become obsessive and then become Israel Adesanya, who I interviewed before I flew out here, the UFC's #1. He's the greatest fighter in the world right now. He's the champion. He was bullied. He was bullied really, really badly in New Zealand, and that sent him in that direction. Or you get bullied really, really badly, and you could become an alcoholic. Yeah. But there's always an adverse. It's almost like, I think it's Einstein's law of relativity, where he says every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So a lot of the time, that's what I search for. And it's really predictable within those parameters. So I learned that we're all really, really fundamentally the same, but at the same time, the outcome of the trauma or the adversity is quite varied. As I said, you can become depressed and an alcoholic, or you can become the greatest in the world. But it tends to be the case that the greatest in the world at things have a trauma story. Tends to be the case.
Interesting. One of my favorite things that you talk about is the idea of building evidence that you can. And I think that's super important. I was really lucky in my career journey to date to have some really amazing mentors who perhaps actually were the ones to point out that I could at times. And I wondered whether you had anybody along the journey who had done that for you, or whether you were doing it for yourself.
I would say like yes and no. So I'd say yes because I've had loads of really supportive people in my life, and there's been occasions where people believed in me in a way which I would hear them say things to me, and you know, and it either reaffirmed my confidence or gave me more confidence. So and they're typically friends of mine, people that really, because strangers saying you're a dumbass or you're Jesus Christ, it doesn't really mean anything.
Irrelevant.
Because they don't have the information to. It's just either hype or criticism. You know,
it means you're doing
hype or
something
hate.
if people are talking.
Yeah, like, and all that stuff, it doesn't mean anything to me. So, but when your like best friends say things to you and they go, that's when I remembered it. And a couple of my best friends have said things to me at certain times, which have proven to be true. And at the time when they said it, I thought, wow, really? Like, you think I can? And then, you know, it's proven to be true. So when they say things to me now, I believe them more, because last time they kind of ran my own confidence. They were ahead of mine. They saw it before I could, and they knew me. So, but then on the other hand, the central thing is, like, you have to go and build evidence for yourself. Ultimately, that's really that's the root of all of our beliefs. Like, if you believe anything in this world, and we're not talking about faith here, I'm saying if you believe things, there's a form of anecdotal or subjective evidence that sits at the heart of that. Like your own beliefs about how good looking you are, or how good you are at X, Y, Z, or how good you are at production, or whatever. They're all actually based on evidence, whether you know it or not. And even if that evidence is wrong, so you might think you're a useless whatever, because some kid said to you on the playground something, and you've kind of held that as part of your self-story for the next decade. But it is evidence, right? Whether wrong or right. And at a very young age, because of my circumstances, because my parents weren't around, I built a ton of evidence that I could make the things I wanted to happen of my own doing. So if I needed really fancy shoes, I could wake up in the morning and do something that would result in really, really fancy shoes. Whether it meant selling something at school or hustling something or putting on an event or whatever. And you learn that very young. And even like there's one example, which I talk about a lot, which is this vending machine thing in my school, which I think was actually quite a pivotal moment for me. I saw the school trying to buy these very expensive vending machines. I wondered why they were doing that, because we had 2,000 students. We should really be getting them for free and making money from them. I went to the computer room of my own doing and sent emails to 5 of the first people that came up on Google that were running vending machine companies. And I asked them for free vending machines and for 20% of the revenue. But the same day, a few hours later, I was pulled out of lessons because someone had shown up with a tape measure. One of my emails had gone to a guy that used to be in our school. He was now the CEO of the biggest vending machine company. He wanted to give the school vending machines and he wanted to give us the revenue. And like that for me,
That's amazing.
Was really interesting evidence at 16 years old, that you can just email people and you can ask them for stuff if you ask in the right way, and it'll pay off. And so I look at what happened from that point onwards, and I did loads of that. And that was really pivotal to me becoming successful, was just asking for things in the right way, not as a beggar, but with some kind of value exchange, even if it's psychological. You can help the school that you went to, or you can help a kid that's whatever. So that stayed with me. That's one point of like evidence that I was lucky enough to get at 16 years old, but I could probably give you 1,000 other types of evidence.
Interesting.
One of them was that, I realized my brothers were super geniuses and I wasn't. And I realized at 16 years old, in school, there's this narrative that if you get D grades, you're going to live a D life. If you get an E, you're going to live an E life, and the people that get A's are going to be rich and happy. That's like the unspoken narrative of school, because they're trying to subtly force you to get better grades. And I realized I wasn't going to get A's or B's or probably C's.
Or E's.
So I needed something else. I needed like some other way to become rich and happy. In my mind, I started throwing these events in our school and started doing all the school trips myself, and the end of summer party, the Halloween party, the whatever party I could organize. And I figured out, especially for my 17th birthday, which was the end of summer party in Devon, I could get 2,000 people to come to somewhere on my birthday and pay £10 each. And I remember reflecting on this when I was 16 years old and thinking, well, these are the people that are going to be the adults. So I'm going to be okay, because when I'm an adult, if I can persuade all of them, these people are going to be my adults with me. If I can persuade them now to do something, I'll be able to persuade them when I'm an adult. And that for me was the moment where I thought, don't need school anymore. And eventually I was expelled for poor attendance. So, but yeah.
I would love to have more time with you, but I would also like to close with a bit of advice for anybody watching. I think we talked about being an entrepreneur. We talked about all the things that you've potentially learned or discovered from people that you've interviewed. One of the most important things that I like that you highlight, and I wonder whether you would still say, because we asked you this question at Emirates Man, is your most important piece of business advice, is this idea of invisible PR, which I really like the idea of this. If you were to give one piece of, very short business advice, is that what it is? This idea of kind of approaching everything, big, small, whoever the person is, so that this invisible PR works for you rather than against you?
So I consider the whole idea of like invisible PR, which is basically the invisible reputation you never get to see, as like broad life advice, like really, really broad life advice. And it's become even more sort of front of mind for me as I've like gone into the public eye a lot more, because like I was looking at before I flew out here, there was this article in the newspaper and it's like me walking to the gym, and a paparazzi has just followed me and my girlfriend to the gym. And I was thinking, like, every interaction I have in my life now is going to be broadcasted in a way that I will never even see. So like these guys here and this lovely lady here, they will, someone might ask them in a couple of weeks, a couple of months, like, how was he? Was he a dickhead? Like that's what you like. Is he like? What's he like? And they are my reputation is now in their hands, and there's a high likelihood that at some point someone will ask them how I was, and so I'm like I've been very particular on just making sure I try to live in line with my values of treating people how I want to be treated at all times. And that means like when I landed at the airport here and the young lady comes up to me and says, oh, I love you. Like, Steve, stop, focus on this person and give them your time and be interested. And I've seen how as my career has ascended, that has mattered so much.
Yeah.
Because someone posts, I met Steve 7 years ago, and he was just really, really nice to me. He stopped and he stayed out on the streets to say hello to everyone till 2 a.m. in the morning when he could have just gone. And I've done that my entire life. Like, you will never see me at an event, and there's no instance in the last 10 years of my life where I've gone to an event and I haven't stayed until the last person's left. Even if it means I stay out until 3 a.m., I don't care. Because I've always really believed in, like, every single interaction you have with every single person, you never ever know the cascading impact of it. And I've also been on the other end of it, where I tell the story in this video that I posted on my Instagram, where for the first time in my life ever, I went up to a guy who was famous, and because my team, I was running the biggest food brand in the world at the time, and my team loved this guy because he was from the TV show Man vs. Food. And I went up to him to ask them a question that all of my employees had asked me to ask him, 400 people waiting, and he just shouts in my face and tells me to, not now. And so I have to go back to my seat, and I had to say to my employees, like, oh, I think he's in a bad mood. Wouldn't answer the question. The question is, what's your favorite sandwich, right? Long story. It's like the question has like a tradition in my company. And I had to tell 400 people, but it gets worse. I told them, I said, listen, he didn't want to answer the question today, whatever. So that's 400 people that I immediately go, oh, maybe he's not a... And then I talk about this example on my podcast.
That's a few
my
more.
Podcast, well, no, no one was listening to my podcast at the time I said it. No one was listening. I have 500 downloads per episode. The podcast gets big. Millions of people start listening a week. He tweets me 7 years later apologizing in a really snarky way. But he tweets me apologizing 7 years later. I then make a video about it, just saying, like, using this whole invisible PR as an example. It gets like 5 million views on LinkedIn. This dude shouting in my face 7 years ago,
Crazy.
the cascading, I mean, if you believe in karma, there you have it.
Yeah.
So for me, that's life advice, which is just like, with everyone you come in contact with, like, try and be your best self and try and treat them, a real fundamental lesson, whether it's employees or just strangers, like, treat other people how you want to be treated. And the cascading, invisible impact of that, you'll just never get to see, but it'll act as like a macro tailwind for you in your life. So it's my religion. My religion is like, you know, I'm very particular on this. So
I think that's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much for
no worries, thank you.
spending some time with us.
Thank you.